podcast. Thanks for joining me. So yeah, Lucy, I wonder if for those there'll be some who are familiar with who you are and the work you've done. Maybe for those, but also for those who aren't familiar with you and maybe just encountering you, who are you and yeah, where are you at right now in your sort of professional life?
Hi, thank you for inviting me. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I've been around for quite a long time, mainly working in adult mental health settings, community mental health teams and inpatient wards, in various places, Luton, London, Bristol, South Wales, and alternating with academic posts. So I've worked for a while at University of the West of England in Bristol. I was also part of the Bristol Clinical Psychology training course from 2001 to 2010. I eventually became head of that course. And since this major project, which we're going to talk about, came out, the Power Threat Meaning Framework, I left the NHS, left in 2016, and my job was now unexpectedly turned into independent mental health trainer and lecturer and writer. So I control my own time now, which is very nice.
Yeah, I can imagine. Okay, great. And so then, which you've alluded to there, you have written extensively for quite a number of years now on for sort of formulations within sort of psychological formulations, but then also some books on alternatives to psychiatric diagnoses. And then, yeah, maybe more recently, the Power Threat Meaning Framework. But I sort of doing some research, even found back, maybe even like 20, 25 years ago, you were writing articles in the BPS on issues around is it electric convulsive therapy?
Electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, yes.
Right, which I actually, I say that was many years ago. I even now I sometimes see you sort of reposting or sharing kind of perhaps issues around it. But I suppose what my question would be is, do you see a driving force or spirit that unites or underpins all of your work?
Yes, I mean, all those strands are still going. I'm still part of an active campaign group about ECT.
Oh, are you okay?
My first book, in fact, was published in 1989, a very long time ago. I won't ask if that was before you were born, but it was a very long time ago.
Yeah,
I was in my 20s.
right,
And there is a common theme, yes. I mean, the common theme is a kind of profound disagreement with a medical model understanding of emotional distress and suffering.
right.
And the kind of conceptual models that that leads to, which I think are deeply inappropriate, flawed, and damaging. The interventions which it leads to, which I think are also largely inappropriate and damaging.
Mm,
And also, and this is the emphasis of the Power Threat Meaning Framework, of course, what can we do instead? So that's the very strong common theme that's been throughout my work. And in fact, and people sometimes, well, people quite regularly ask me, when did you realize that all this, or come to the view that, basically psychiatry is based on a mistaken understanding of distress?
mm.
And some people do have that kind of either growing awareness or light bulb moment when they get involved in psychiatry, but it's the other way around for me. I went into clinical psychology because I already believed that it was doing something profoundly wrong.
Right.
And in fact, that belief itself, I mean, goes back a long way to my early teens at least. So
Right. So, because I was going to ask, have you always been this sort of perhaps forthright? But or
well,
did that?
a
Yeah.
journalist called me strident once, which I very much objected to. I've always had this strong belief. Yeah, I always
Yeah.
have. I always have. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then you mentioned there an awareness of I don't even know, maybe not even the limitations, but just the very manner in which psychiatry frames distress. I think it'd be fair to say, even with the power threat meaning stuff, it even now calls into question perhaps how some of the axioms which you see in psychiatric frameworks exist even in perhaps to an extent psychological frameworks. So it's not just psychiatry, maybe a bit less so psychologically, but they still exist. Was that understanding there at the beginning of your journey? Were you kind of also aware that maybe psychological approach is needed? And
Yeah,
then,
no, absolutely. Yes. I mean, you're right. And I'm glad you said that because a lot of the people try to frame the power threat meaning framework as somehow anti-psychiatrists in
Mm,
some specific senses. It's not against a professional group of people, and it's not against, that particular body. It's
mm,
against essentially all forms of individualized and medicalized thinking, and that's rampant in clinical psychology as well. I have
right.
profound disagreements with many of my clinical psychology colleagues, and conversely, I have very good relationships with some brave psychiatrists who kind of dissent from the kind of major model into which they've been brainwashed. So, I mean, a lot of clinical psychology I would describe as medical model psychology, narrow
Mm,
versions of CBT, for example.
mm.
And I think there's a place for some of those ideas as strategies, but as a model for understanding human distress, they're kind of extremely flawed, and I would say very often as damaging as their kind of, more obviously medical. Well, these two things often run alongside each other, don't they? The kind of the pills for the so-called illness of depression and the CBT to adjust your unfortunately negative thinking. They reinforce each other. I think they're both very unhelpful.
Yes, very much. And maybe we'll get onto that.
Okay.
We can get onto a bit later, because it's around the, how would you say, the scope or the latitude that an individual practitioner has, a psychologist, for example, and actually, perhaps if they become aware of the power threat meaning framework, because in a way, I suppose the power threat meaning framework is not just for psychologists or psychiatrists. It's more help perhaps like policy and stuff like that. But anyway, so with regards to the power threat meaning framework, I think it's now, was it 2030? It was about 2013 it came out.
2018.
Oh, it was in sorry, that was it. But it
Mm.
was in response. It's began around 2013. Is that right
Uh,
or
well,
not? I
in
made that up.
some ways, its roots are in the 2013 BPS position statement
Right.
on classification, which was a kind of bold and brave statement that came out, and I don't think would happen nowadays. Personnel have changed, and
Right.
BPS is fundamentally a very conservative organisation. But at that time, there were people around who were prepared to stick their necks out of it. So in 2013, DSM-5 came out, and at the same time, the BPS issued a position statement, which took 2 years to draw up. Very tedious process. I mean, it's only about half a page long, so I don't know why it took so long. I was part of that. Well, it took so long because it's politically kind of very sensitive.
Right.
Essentially, I was saying very clearly, the diagnostic model of distress, has run out of time. It doesn't work. We need, and they use this term, a paradigm shift. We don't use
Mm,
it in the framework, in fact, but they use the term, we need a paradigm shift to a fundamentally different way of conceptualizing distress.
mhm.
So, and it sort of ended with the core to develop more of those kind of alternative approaches. So that was our kind of justification, if you like, and that was what allowed us as the PTMF author group to get funding from the Division of Clinical Psychology in order to carry out this project.
Sure. So
Yeah.
yeah, what are the major points that the power threat meaning framework is trying to, yeah, tackle?
Okay, so I'll kind of sketch in the background just briefly. So if no one's ever heard of it, they will kind of get
Mm,
a general sense of where it comes from. So the Power Threat Meaning Framework is a very, very ambitious project that was led by me and my friend and colleague, Professor Mary Boyle, who's a retired clinical psychologist, and a core author group of 9, two of whom are survivors of the psychiatric system, and a larger project group of about 40 people. About a third in total were people who'd had personal experience of psychiatric interventions. And it kind of happened completely by accident. So a group of us met in 2012 completely accidentally for a different purpose and started a very exciting conversation about, well, if we didn't have the DSM and ICD, what would we have instead if we didn't have a diagnostic medical model of distress? And these are people I've known for many years. I've known Mary for about 35 years. And between us, from our academic, clinical, and personal experience, none of us have ever bought into the medical model of distress. But when you start to think, well, what do we have instead? Then that's a much bigger question. And of course, there are lots of kind of specific answers to that question, which I think are great. So there's trauma-informed practice, there's narrative therapy, there are systemic therapy, there are lots of ways of not using the medical model as your starting point, but we were actually intending something much bigger and more ambitious, which is why I've called it a framework, not a model. I mean, it's not a model, it's a framework, a sort of
Mm.
meta model, if you like. So the idea was to produce a fundamental set of principles which would, incidentally add extra evidence and support for a lot of the very good non-diagnostic practice that's out there. So we're not saying that's not good enough. We're saying that's fantastic, and this may give you extra evidence and support and perspectives to enhance what you're already doing, and also suggest its own way forward. So we ended up after a really quite agonizing and very difficult process of 5 years with what is in effect a very dense academic philosophical document.
Right.
Not easy to read. You'll know that if you've tried.
Yeah.
Free to read, it's all
Mm.
available on the BPS website. I'll give you the links.
Yes.
Published by the BPS, not an official clinical psychology approach. Psychologists don't have to have anything to do with it if they don't want, nor does anyone else.
Mm.
Not a policy document, not a framework for action, not a manual of how to do it. It's works at a very, very, very basic set of
Mm.
core assumptions. And in order to get to those core assumptions, you have to trace back, the medical model, medical aspects of psychology, all this a very, very long way to work out what are the roots of this stuff.
Right.
Because if you don't kind of go right down to the roots, then the danger is that you end up with a kind of modified version of the same thing. And I think we see a lot of that. We see sort of modified versions of medical model approaches, modified
Mm.
versions of CBT, etc. But
Mm.
we were actually a lot more ambitious than that. So that's how it ended up. But I mean, there are partly because it's long and dense and complicated. There are a lot of misunderstandings about it floating around, and some of them
Right.
are understandable and some of them are deliberate. But it's not particularly about services. It's not about psychology. It's not about psychiatry specifically. It's if you're
Mm.
anything, it's about, how do human beings understand emotional suffering in the world we live in?
Yes.
So if I had to sum up our answer in our response in kind of very simply, it's instead of diagnostic understandings, we need narrative-based understandings. Narrative in the broadest sense. We can talk
Mm.
about that. Where does formulation fit into that? We can talk about that. Narrative in the broadest sense. We need to shift from asking what's wrong with you to what's happened to you. That's a well-known slogan from trauma-informed practice. And the narratives need to make the link between personal distress and social inequality and injustice at all levels.
Yes.
So that's it, absolutely in a nutshell. But again, narratives aren't, we're not seeing that as, professional skills or property. Do you know what I mean? There's a
Mm.
sentence in the framework which says we're all, as human beings, storytellers and meaning makers. So, as
Yes.
well as being demedicalizing, in a sense, it's deprofessionalizing. So, a lot of the critiques and certainly some of the attacks are completely missing the point. They're kind of saying things like, well, it's psychologists trying to take over from psychiatrists. Well, I mean, actually, the full implications of the framework would be that psychologists are in many ways just as at fault, and we don't need more psychiatrists. We don't probably don't need more psychologists.
Mm.
I mean, we wanted to raise really provocative questions in the sense, do we need psychologists at all? Why do we have a mental health system? It's not about, the
Mm.
PTMF is being rolled out to kind of change mental health systems and narratives are being forced on patients. I mean, really, if you read it thoroughly, it should raise the question of what is a mental health system? What is a mental health problem? I personally don't believe there's such a thing as a mental health problem. This is a
Mm.
relatively recent Western construct. If you don't believe in that, then everything else is up for question. So sorry, that's a bit of a roundabout explanation, but
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
that's in essence what it is. And if you want a really simple introduction, then I'll send you the link to a book that Mary and I wrote called A
Yes. I think.
Shocking Introduction to the Pathway Meaning Framework, which we very much intended to be accessible to ordinary people who aren't versed in a philosophical discourse.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. 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 Sure. Yeah. Yeah, that's because I actually did read some of that book as well. Because like you mentioned, the actual original document's pretty long and it's quite dense at points. But I did read some of it, and actually, it's jogged my memory with you saying there. Because actually, yes, a lot of it is all. It's almost like to an extent a societal critique as well. You know, you sort of call into question or at least highlight the implications of like neoliberalism and
Mhm.
the concept, yeah, what that's like, and how that leads to distress and meaning really and as you said narratives. I think narratives is very much at the center, isn't it, of all of it really. It's
Yeah,
yeah. And though and you also at the beginning of the document you reference a few alternative models which perhaps at least the way I read it was that you were positing them and saying that they are different, they're somewhat alternative, but they're almost maybe not alternative enough.
yeah,
And they were, for example, Crittenden's maturational model, I think it's Paul Gilbert's compassion focused therapy model,
yeah, yeah,
and the trauma informed model.
yeah.
Is that a fair reading that you were sort of saying that they have a lot of utility in sort of moving away, but maybe they haven't quite been able to move away enough?
Yes. I mean, I think all of those are great. And, we'd want very much to support them. This is not about undermining them and saying you've got it
Sure.
wrong,
Yeah, of course,
but
yeah.
it's about saying, it's very, very, very difficult to really stand back from our core assumptions. And that's what we tried during the framework, but we didn't completely successfully do that.
Mm,
But the PTMF itself, I can see ways in which we have failed to challenge our core assumptions. So, we're all, you know, deeply kind of brainwashed in a way by these core, largely westernized assumptions.
mm,
So, yeah, yeah. I mean, and,
sure.
and, and actually, the framework is attempting to outline the principles of something that is broader than any of those models.
Yes, yes. And okay, so would it be fair to say then that talking about what those models, in a sense, the ones that the power threat meaning framework is responding to, are that they
Well, we're not just responding to those, but we're saying let's have a look at some key examples that actually do have a lot to offer and
right?
say, do they go far enough? And we're saying there
Oh,
are
sorry.
lots
Yeah,
of things. Yeah,
yeah, sure, sure. No, no. Yeah, I
yeah,
get you. Yeah, yeah. No, I was then thinking more about perhaps the
yeah.
medical model stuff that the power threat meaning framework is responding to. Is that fundamentally they're rooted in this sort of individualistic, kind of atomistic way of looking at distress, in which it's something that happens to the individual, and therefore that the individual is essentially responsible for resolving their distress. Whereas, yeah, the power threat meaning framework, at least, and also the other thing I think that's really key to the power threat meaning framework, and this maybe if we actually elaborate on what power threat and meaning are in it, but is yeah, it's the sort of hermeneutics, and that maybe is related to narrative and meaning, and that the traditional ways of understanding distress in perhaps at least in the West, I don't know about elsewhere, but at least in the West, is that the way in which we've formulated, I don't know if even know if formulate is the right word, but particularly say psychiatric diagnoses, they're sort of hermeneutically dead. There's no sort of inherent sense as to kind of how the distress makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, we are saying yes that the core assumptions on which all our understandings of distress in westernized countries are based are specific and on the whole not based on evidence and certainly not worldwide and don't seem to be working very well. But that includes, I mean, the idea that distress arises within the individual is a complex mixture of you've got to pull yourself together or you've got to get an expert to do it for you,
Mm,
itself based on a particular view of the self as separate from people around you. So I think,
right.
you know, one of the ways in which I think the framework hasn't really gone far enough, not we're planning to rewrite it, but is that it didn't challenge the notion of the self enough.
Oh, okay.
And, so I think even though we tried our best, I think the framework itself is kind of too individualistic framed in some ways.
Oh, right.
Having said that, in westernized societies, that's going to make it, in some senses, that's inappropriate within westernized societies within which that is our starting point. But we would hope, I think in retrospect, would have hoped to go further beyond that.
Mm,
And the ultimate example of an individualized explanation is a diagnostic one, of course.
mm,
And I mean, there are many problems with psychiatric diagnosis, but I mean, the interesting thing is that the very people who draw up these diagnostic manuals are saying they're not fit for purpose. So
mm,
Dr. Alan Francis, the chair of the DSM-4 committee, had a real go at DSM-5 for all
mm,
sorts of reasons, which I won't formulate here, but I don't think he's acting in good faith entirely. But anyway, he said DSM-5 is neither safe nor scientifically sound. As you've just quoted, Thomas Insel, the former head of NIMH, the world's largest funding body for psychiatric research in America, has admitted we spent £20 billion dollars rather on genetic and other types of research. We got nowhere. Well,
mm,
we can all think of better ways that $20 billion dollars could have been used to relieve people's circumstances which lead to distress.
mm,
So the curious thing is that we're challenging a diagnostic model that has received its most, trenchant criticisms recently from the very people who are responsible for inventing it.
mm.
So it's kind of quite paradoxical how we're kind of saying, I'm not allowed to say it when they're saying it. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, yes.
So in essence, and billions of dollars are currently being poured into rewriting the diagnostic models from scratch. So we have projects called HiTop and RDoc and
Mm,
this, which are still fundamentally misconceived in my view, but they're a sign that the paradigm is crumbling from the inside, and yet it's openly stated, but it's kind of a secret. They're trying desperately to go and put something else in place as quick as they can, but nobody else's need to mental point out in the meanwhile that the emperor has no clothes. So we're left with under a basic model of distress that is absolutely not based on evidence, and specifically not based on the kind of evidence that it needs to be if we're to accept that these are fundamentally medical conditions, as we're told, just like diabetes, all the rest of that kind of
yes,
bullshit.
yes, yes.
So, I mean, as Peter Breggin, critical psychiatrist for America, said, we're left in the position of having a medical specialty that doesn't deal with medical illnesses.
Mm,
That is a little bit embarrassing. Why they're rushing to plug the gap, which they won't be able to unless they step back from these very core assumptions, which they're clearly not able to do for all sorts of reasons. And we are attempting to say, well, there is a gap. I mean, you said it yourself, guys. Thanks. There is a gap. And look, how about this as a way forward, or at least as the start of a way forward?
yes,
We're really not claiming. One of the rather annoying things that people often say is we are boasting that we've produced a paradigm shift. Now, in scientific terms, a paradigm shift is a kind of major shift of perspective that's incompatible with a previous.
yes, yes,
It's
yes.
like, you probably know this, the change from the kind of the sun goes around the earth to the earth goes around the sun, the world is flat, the world is round. It'd be very arrogant to claim to have done that, and we have not claimed that. What we
Mm,
have said is we need a paradigm shift, and we want to do our very best to outline some first steps and think about what that might look like and think about the principles on which it might be based. Hence the framework.
yeah, 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 for sure. And which you'll be well aware of. I suppose for people who maybe aren't, this is for people listening who aren't aware. You're definitely, you and your, I don't know, colleagues with the Power Threat Meaning Framework are not alone either in sort of being
No.
very critical of these ways of that we've conceptualized distress, i.e., DSM, ways of looking at things. For example, I mean, Joanna, you've got people like Joanna Moncrief or James, is it James Davies and stuff?
James Davis, yeah.
Yeah, who are kind of coming at it from the same sort of perspective, but maybe it's from slightly different positions.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, I mean, I know all these people quite well because there's a kind of large, loose, unofficial group of network of people, both professionals and survivors of services who know
mm,
each other, meet regularly, draw from each other's work, So, I mean, that's fantastic. And that's actually very different from how it was because
right,
when my Used and Abused of Psychiatry, my first book came out in 1989, it felt like I was the only person saying it.
really.
1990, Mary Boyle published Schizophrenia: A Scientific Delusion, and Richard Bentall published uh, Deconstructing Schizophrenia, or is it Reconstructing? Never remember which. Anyway, so then there were three books. Mary and Richard are
Mm,
still going strong, and so am I. But
right.
we've been joined by lots and lots of other friends and supporters and allies, which is fab.
Yeah, it must be. That must be quite nice to experience that. Yeah, people sort of starting to see your perspective. I'm curious though, are there any, I don't know, yeah, psychologists, or maybe it's more philosophers that if you look at your own way of seeing things that have like shaped, yeah, your way of looking at things or the power threat meaning framework. I mean, you cite, for example, people like Foucault and stuff like that. It,
Yeah.
or not? Did this all just mainly come from your own personal sort of perspective or experiences, and you then latterly sort of found a few people that support that view, or have there been a few, authors that you've read their work and really spurred you on and kind of like, oh wow.
Um, yeah, I mean, as you say, there's a lot of kind of philosophy in the framework. It's collectively authored. There's a lot of Foucault in it. I mean, I'm not nearly as familiar with Foucault as some of the other contributors, so it was then largely them that wrote those bits. Um, I mean, I started reading psychology books, I mean, and philosophy books actually when I was quite young.
Mm,
Um, and I guess, I don't know, a lot of people have influenced me.
right.
People no one's ever heard of nowadays. Well, not that's not quite true. I spent a lot of my teenage years reading Jung,
Oh really?
being a very boring teenager, uh,
Wow.
while other teenagers were going out to parties and doing exciting things. I guess I'm quite influenced by R.D. Laing, who was a very, very flawed character, but nobody's ideal therapist. But
Mm,
I don't think. But I mean, extraordinarily insightful man. And
mm,
his central message, as I understand it, is that madness has meaning. And I think that's, in a way, that's our central message.
mm.
I mean, I've been very influenced by Judith Herman's book, Trauma and Recovery. She's a
Oh yeah.
psychiatrist, now in her 80s, I think, who wrote this groundbreaking book in 1992, Trauma and Recovery, which crystallized a lot of the stuff that at some level, any clinician knows, people who
Yes.
end up in psychiatric services had difficult lives, but she was the originator really of the kind of trauma-informed approach. So there's a lot of those things sort of coming together.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Young. I kind of think Young would probably be I don't know. It's a huge speculation, but I think he would probably be somewhat skeptical of where psychiatric diagnoses have gone. Um, but anyway, so yeah, okay. So the power threat meaning framework, more in practice, perhaps. What does power look, or what can power look like? And because I'm thinking it probably people have probably ideas of power when the word gets thrown out, but actually, I think the power threat meaning framework shows that power can be perhaps more distal or perhaps more diffuse than we might typically think of. So, yeah, what are there some examples of what power looks like?
Okay, so just to put that in a bit of context, so as we said, the framework essentially argues that narrative understandings, in other words, meaning-based understandings, can replace diagnostic ones. So the framework suggests a possible structure for narratives. It's only a suggestion. Again, a lot of people have taken this very literally. There are all sorts of ways of constructing narratives
Mm,
that are at least equally valid, but we have suggested one way, and it's based on four core questions. And these questions can be, they're not about asking them in a particular order or even in those words, constructing a narrative as a kind of iterative process. It evolves over time, etc., etc.
right,
So nothing's set in stone. But essentially, the first question, I mean, I can go through the questions. The first question is, what has happened to you? And in PTMF terms, that can be translated to how is power operating in your life? So the biggest thing that we think the framework has put back into narrative understandings is power. So, we're really not the first to say this stuff. I mean, 90% of what's in the framework, or more, 95% isn't new. We've put it together in a slightly new way, I think. And it's like every
Mm-mm.
generation has to rediscover this stuff. So we're not claiming isn't this amazing? The human race has existed for 200,000 years and now we've cracked the problem.
Yeah.
But in essence, all the things that we critique are approaches that omit or actively exclude the operation of power. So
Mm,
diagnosis actively excludes a consideration of the operation of power because it's all
mm,
brain chemistry or whatever else it is. So power we interpret in quite a broad sense. We've looked at a number of different forms of power, so legal power, interpersonal power, coercive power, economic and material power. But we've also looked at more subtle forms of power like social capital, things that you're sometimes born with or acquire, like a certain class background or access to economic resources or a good education and so on. And specifically, we've looked at the role of ideological power, which
mm,
is often not included. So what we mean by that is the kind of assumptions and expectations and social norms that are powerful, that are operating in any given society or group.
mm,
The more subtle form of power that results in us feeling we have to live up to certain expectations, or it defines what is meant by success or failure, or maybe encourage us to compare with ourselves with others, and what it shapes what we understand to be the right way of being a man or a woman or a student or a mother or whatever else it is. So the addition of that, I think, helps us to explain distress in people who don't have obvious trauma histories. The
mm,
framework draws a lot from trauma-informed practice, but there are certainly people who've had comfortable lives and, been fortunate in how things have turned out and supportive relationships and so on who are nevertheless struggling. And in those kind of cases, well, in fact, in every case, but particularly in those cases, you often need to look at, well, how is ideological power operating here? What are the assumptions that are shaping the way that you are now judging yourself to be a failure or to be, inadequate or to be weak or whatever it is?
mm.
So that's power. Shall I go through the questions?
Yeah, yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah, go
Not
for
that
it.
far. So the question, they're not separate questions the way they're different angles on
Yes.
the same, whatever it is you're thinking about. So as soon as you start thinking about power, you inevitably start thinking about, well, how did it affect you? In other framework terms, what kind of threats does this pose? So how does this play out in your life? I feel too ashamed to go out, or, I can't afford to feed my family, or whatever it is. The central thread, what sense did you make of it? In other words, what is the meaning of these experiences? Hence, power, threat, meaning.
Mm,
And meaning, of course, is not just our personal meanings. I feel ashamed, I feel hopeless, etc. But the meanings we get from all around us. So that's ideological power again. And finally, what did you have to do to survive, or what kinds of threat response are you using? So this covers the area that we sometimes describe as symptoms in psychiatric terms or
mm,
psychological terms, but in essence, the way we see it, threat responses are always there as a response to a threat, which arises in a power context. So by the time you get to this part of the narrative, hopefully this is making sense. It's not surprising I feel the need to harm myself because I feel so bad about myself, and the reason I started feeling bad about myself is this happened, and I picked up the messages that it was my fault, or,
mm.
whatever else. And alongside that, of course, you need to think what are your strengths and pull it together into what is your story.
Yes.
That's the heart of the framework, if you like, and that's the main avenue into, well, what might this look like in practice. So the book, to which I'll give you a link, Straight Talk Introduction to the Power Threat Meaning Framework, takes those questions one by one in a series of chapters,
Mm,
thinks about how you or someone you're working with or supporting might use these questions to construct a narrative that might suggest different ways forward for you.
sure. Yeah, yeah, definitely. I'll link the book. And interesting you mentioned that in the sense how you say we can decompose these into sort of, power, threat, meaning, but actually in a way in reality, it doesn't necessarily, it's not as simple as that. And I think particularly for me, and maybe it's just I need to read up on it more, but I was at times getting a bit confused between threat and meaning and sort of seeing them almost as interchangeable.
Yeah.
You
Well,
know,
they're linked. I mean,
yeah,
they do overlap. Yeah.
yeah,
So, I mean, I often do an exercise in training where we have a story and I have flip charts on the wall, power, threat, meaning, threat, and I ask people to derive elements from the story that might represent threats or meanings. But I
mm,
always say, don't worry which heading these are going under. They're
right,
interlinked. That,
right,
your thoughts will almost certainly appear under two, three, or perhaps all of the headings from different
right.
perspectives.
Oh, that
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense then.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I mean, they're prompts for thinking in a way. They're prompts for thinking. Well, I mean, what they're really, really not is some new form of assessment.
Mm,
How
mm,
good was your sleep? And, do you
mm.
do you get regular exercise? It's not that kind of question at all.
Yes, 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 yes. And one of the areas the document, I believe, tries to address, almost perhaps preempting some criticisms, is it does account for biology and sort of is able to recast or sort of put biology within this lens. Am I right in that
Yeah, yeah,
that is a form of power as
yeah.
such?
Well, absolutely. So one of the other criticisms is that we're somehow ignoring the role of the body. Well, absolutely, we're not. Absolutely, we're not. And I think trauma-informed theory and practice is very useful here because that shows how, of course, we respond to all human experiences at a bodily level,
Mm,
as well as at a kind of, psychological level.
mm,
Whatever is happening in our lives, whether we see the experiences as problematic or not, they're reflected at some level in our bodies. But we're seeing our bodies, our bodily reactions, we've got a phrase enabling and mediating the experience of distress. We can't feel distress without having a body to feel it, the kind of anxious feeling in our stomachs or whatever it is.
mm,
But we're not offering a kind of simplistic explanation of the kind that psychiatry does. Your chemical imbalance causes your depression, or this
mm,
particular gene poses no risks for schizophrenia or whatever else it is.
mm. Yes. Which I don't even understand how. I mean, I know that there probably are there are a lot of psychiatrists or neuroscientists who aren't merely neural reductionists, but I don't even understand how that makes sense. And it's also interesting that that narrative of the kind of neural reductionism, how it has kind of permeated its way throughout society. Because I was talking to someone recently, I think it was family members once talking in reference to maybe other family members when they perhaps got to a point where they were quite distressed and maybe what would be coined depression or anxiety, and they'd gone to the doctors and they were somewhat skeptical of taking medication, and they'd been given this analogy of, well, if you had diabetes, or
Yeah,
if you had
yeah,
and said in such a way as though that is the fact, almost as though that is the case, that is the
yeah,
truth.
yeah.
um,
It's
yeah,
grossly misleading and irresponsible. And
yeah,
I think a lot of GPs and doctors used to believe that that's what they were trained, but the information is out there now. There's no excuse for perpetuating these, they're lies, and they're lies that trap people.
yeah. um and okay, so then with regards to, if we think of, yeah, power, and the other thing I wanted to say actually is really interesting about the power threat meaning framework. We've mentioned Foucault and stuff, but I mean, I suppose, yeah, power in a way is very, at least is how I read it. It might not be how you or the authors putting it together saw it, but and again, I'm not when I cite him, I think he's another, like many philosophers or individuals, he kind of became misrepresented, was misrepresented. But is Nietzsche, and Nietzsche wrote very much around this will to power, and he even asked, it's like, what is truth? What is truth? Why is it we're so fixated with truth? But what he was getting at, in my understanding, was that this sort of we can, even truth and this claim of truth in itself is a form of power and of exerting
Yeah, yeah,
power. So, and I think the power threat meaning framework highlights this, that even this notion of scientific objectivity
Yeah,
is not free of value. It's value laden
yeah,
in
yeah,
the sense of being able to control and then predict things, which in turn perhaps then has its downstream values, such as being blunt, perhaps economic profit, things like that. So
yeah.
yeah, which I found really interesting.
Yes, I mean, we're challenging the idea that, facts can always be distinguished from values. And
Yes, that's exactly what I was getting at. Yeah.
yeah, and we're also challenging, we like to say that the framework is evidence-based, which it is, in this
Mm,
we have a massive amount of evidence to support our thesis that it's about what's happened to you, poverty and abuse and so on. But we're also challenging the whole notion of evidence, which is also, as currently used, a kind of ideological construct. What counts as evidence is a randomized controlled trial, but it's useful for some purposes. But what absolutely
mm,
doesn't count as evidence is what ordinary people are saying about their lives.
mm.
So there's another kind of trap. And we see both those forms of evidence as relevant. One isn't somehow inferior to be overridden by a kind of top scientist saying, no, you're wrong about this.
And how, yeah, so how you mentioned sort of this kind of lived experience or individuals, because often I suppose in a way I'm not saying it is as simple as it's not necessarily as simplistic as this, but we can see it as you've got professionals sitting in their ivory towers pontificating over definitions and stuff. Whereas I think the power threat meaning framework is one project which, amongst others, which is very much try to recruit or lean into people's perspectives who've actually had what I know you don't like the term mental health problem, but who would have been given a mental health label perhaps or gone through the system. So is that being, yeah, how sort of, is that quite central to all of this, trying to lean on or draw from rather people's perspectives who've gone through all of this in a way, rather than it just being about professionals disagreeing over definitions?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's interesting the responses we've had to the framework from some academics have claimed it's unreadable. I mean, and it is difficult to read. Whereas looking at the same document, some survivors who don't necessarily have an academic background have managed to have grasped the essence of it and said to us, it's common sense, really, isn't it?
Mm,
Absolutely. So from their lived experience point of view, it makes sense. Yeah.
mm,
So really, we want something that, I mean, there are lots and lots of versions of it now on the website. So there's podcasts and interviews and shorter versions, and people have developed, we've got a couple of sort of those sort of cartoon versions you can do. So there are lots of accessible, easy ways in, because we really wanted it to be accessible to anybody, no matter what their background, and to make sense to them. And we've been particularly pleased that some peer groups have taken up the framework with no professional input at all. They've
oh
decided to
wow.
use it by taking one question each week, discussing it as a group. Does this make sense to us? There's a couple of articles on the website which describe this process that two peer groups, I mean, separately,
Mm,
independently undertook, found it extremely enlightening. That does make us, I think, particularly happy because that's how we want it to work. It's about giving
mm,
some power and tools back to ordinary people so they can then kind of have the opportunity, if they want, to
mm.
make sense of their lives in a different way.
Yes, that's great. Yeah. And Going just going back to the well, it makes me think of you mentioned in the document blame or brain.
Yeah.
What is that? This notion of blame or brain?
Okay, so this is an idea developed by Mary Boyle. So it's the idea that we have at our disposal in our society at the moment rather simplistic ways of understanding distress, rather simplistic binary ways. You see this an awful lot, I think, on social media. So it's like if it's my brain, my biochemical imbalance, or my genetics, or my neurodiversity, or whatever it is, it's not my fault. Thank God, I don't have to feel so guilty and bad and ashamed about it. It's no wonder I'm finding life so difficult.
Mm,
And the only alternative to that seems to be it must be my fault. I must be weak, inadequate, failing, or, whatever, blame or brain. And you see this an awful lot on people testifying on social media as, I was told I had ADHD or I'm autistic,
Mm,
felt a huge sense of I didn't feel so guilty for failing all my life. Last time it
right.
wasn't my fault. It's like there's only two possibilities.
Mm,
And I wouldn't want to take away a sense of relief or from guilt and shame from anyone, but I think it's important to ask, well, why do we only have those two possibilities? Because that keeps us kind of knocking backwards and forwards between
yes.
two extremes, neither of which are helpful and or in some sense true.
Mm,
And it prevents us from looking at could there be something in the middle? Because as soon as people feel blamed and shamed, of course, they get very angry and, don't want to hear anymore. It's understandable. But I suppose what we're trying to offer is something in the middle, and that's how I understand formulation, actually, as psychologists, where I hope
mm,
neither saying it's your chemical imbalance, go away and take your pills, nor what a useless person you must be, try harder. We're
mm,
saying, well, let's see if we can put together a formulation which shows
sure.
that actually the core message of any formulation, you are doing your very best in difficult circumstances. And with support and thinking a bit more about understanding how this arose, we may be able to find different ways forward.
Mm,
So that's an in the middle, but that kind of narrative it's more complex, of course. And of course,
mm.
what that involves is looking at all sorts of things that we may not want to look at as individuals, as a society. But that has to be, the only constructive way of approaching it, getting out of the brain or blame binary.
Yes, and you mentioned there the formulation, and then it makes me think of coming back to something we spoke about earlier was this notion of threat response symptoms being seen as threat responses.
Yeah,
Yeah, and actually, yeah, it's quite it's almost simple, but it's radically different because it in a sense then it kind of re it provides a sense of agency in a way back to the person rather than it just being this kind of epiphenomena of some underlying disturbance that the fact that you're dissociating or the fact that you're avoiding for things rather than it just being oh well it's just something that's happening to me because of whereas actually it's like well no maybe it makes it it's a response and it makes sense and it's probably going to be hard to actually not do engage in this response because it has at periods of your life probably protected you. It's
yeah,
just it's now
yeah,
harming you. It's quite
yeah.
it's almost inverting it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and that bit comes a lot from trauma-informed practice, where the understanding, at least the way I think trauma-informed practice should be understood, is thank goodness you were able to do these things, because that's one of the
Mm,
things that's protected you and kept you going. But it
mm,
seems like those ways of surviving have now become problematic in themselves. And,
mm.
you may not need them anymore. There may be other ways of surviving. But in essence, what the framework is trying to do is to reconnect the threat response to the threat. So to understand that the threat responses come from a place where you had to survive a threat understood in the broadest sense.
Mm,
Of course, the most effective way of disconnecting the threat response from the threat is to impose a diagnostic understanding. So you get this bizarre disconnect, which I never understand, to be honest. We know people living in deprived neighborhoods are more likely to be depressed. Is it surprising? You ask any person on the street, people who are struggling to make ends meet and even to heat their homes are feeling more miserable. No, it's not. But then we disconnect the threat response from the threat by saying there's an epidemic of depression.
mm,
And then we start thinking about new pills and,
mm.
that there's a disconnect there which immediately comes into play. So what we one way can see entirely clearly then becomes invisible to us as individuals. So the individuals take on this idea and I'm struggling and I've got depression and at a societal level. So we end up with the wrong interventions at every level.
Yes. And one of those levels is where perhaps mental health professionals find themselves And I think, it'd be fair to say, well, would it be fair to say that the power threat meaning framework is not merely for mental health professionals, and that it
No, it's
might be
definitely not. Definitely not. No.
right,
I mean, having said that, a lot of mental health professionals have shown an interest in it. It's fab. Very, very much welcome that. But it's not about mental health professionals or for mental health professionals.
right?
No. I mean, great if they want to take it on board. And some have in it. There's a very ambitious project in inpatient wards in northwest London where a very dedicated group of professionals have introduced power threat meaning framework based formulations in conjunction with trauma-informed strategies on all the inpatient wards with amazingly positive results.
Yes, I saw. I can link that as well. Actually, that was I think it was in
Mm.
Frontiers. It got published recently.
Yes, there's two articles. The second one just came out 2 days ago. Yeah,
Yeah.
looking at the results. And the second paper, I think, is in some ways more interesting because it looks at how did this happen, looks at the process. So this is qualitative data.
Mm.
The theme seems to be both for staff and service users. As soon as I had a different way of understanding these forms of extreme distress, then other things followed. I could
Mm.
see that, well, a lot of what we usually do is actually damaging. I could see that we could offer this, this, and this instead.
Yeah.
So different ways of thinking, and the framework is fundamentally about different ways of thinking, because if we don't think differently, we won't be doing anything else differently. We won't be practicing differently.
Okay.
Specifically.
Yeah. And then thinking just for a moment, perhaps, more psychologically, or not, no, not more psychologically, rather, perhaps from, say, the perspective of a psychologist or somebody working as a psychologist within the NHS or in another country, it could be even. What do because you did an interview with at some point, I think, with Awais Aftab, and it's like a written up one though.
Yeah, yeah, it's a vase. Yes, it
A
was.
vase,
Yes,
yes,
we did it
vase.
by email.
Right. And in that,
Not my favorite person in the world by a long way, but anyway, go on.
okay, okay. But in the interview, you said, or I think you were responding to the question and delineating formulations from the power threat meaning framework and saying that they're not isomorphic. So then I suppose what I'm wondering is, to what extent can or does a formulation relate to the power threat meaning framework insofar as what what does would a psychologist get by integrating or considering the power threat meaning framework beyond just perhaps say taking a formulation approach as you've written in your books, whether that's through a CBT lens, a psychodynamic lens? Does that make sense? The question.
Support the use of formulation, but there are all sorts of ways of formulating, of course. So what the power threat meaning framework would hope to do would be to encourage use of formulation that's in line with PTMF principles, which of course would very much include the role of power.
Mm,
Yeah, there may be a case, I think, for a very simplistic formulation about how your anxious thoughts lead to your kind of, you know, automatic nervous reaction, which you then respond to with more anxious thoughts and so on. Not kind of trying to outlaw that kind of very specific, what's happening in this particular situation problem, but a broader level, I think, of formulations need to be based on an awareness of power.
right.
So actually, at the back of the overview document, there's a long list of about 20 points, bullet points that you might want to take into account if you're thinking
Mm,
about formulation and you want to make sure that it is also coming from a PTMF perspective.
right. Yes. Um, And on that, actually, well, briefly, just going back, actually, not that I feel I don't, I kind of just in my head, I think, do I need to mention it? I don't think I do, but I only came onto that as well because I actually spoke with Aves.
Yeah, yeah.
I
Oh,
did
right.
a
Tell
while
me.
ago, just because I do find it interesting talking to psychiatrists. But yeah, not that I don't have an opinion in here nor there, but I did speak with him, and yeah, he is very he has a blog, doesn't he? And he's quite prodigious in his output. In that he is trying. Yeah, I suppose understandably, he's trying to, I suppose, uphold psychiatry, isn't he? Because it's his profession.
Well, he is, but I mean, I think the conflict for him, as I see it, is that he's posing as a critic. So obviously, a critic who's
Oh, I
trying to
see.
a critic who's trying to uphold psychiatry has
I see, I see.
is only willing to be critical up to a certain point.
Interesting. And actually, that would then kind of cut, which I think it's fairly well known for people who use, I don't know if you use Twitter anymore, but there was at one point
So,
a debate, if you could put it, between two psychiatrists, Alves and Joanna Moncrief, around.
yeah, yeah.
So, yes, it's interesting actually how you can have two kind of, yeah, critics or psychiatric critics, but have, yeah, very different perspectives on to what point you should criticize something. But anyway, so coming back to the formulation, I mean, I suppose there are different modalities within psychology. You know, you've got compassion focused therapy, which you mentioned is perhaps a bit more sensitive to the more distal ways in which power and threats manifest, versus say CBT. And I don't want to, I'm not using CBT because I have a particular issue with it, or I think it's necessarily more pernicious than other psychological modalities, at least with regards to contextualizing the wider, factors that maybe need to be borne in mind when making sense out of distress. So how, I mean, have you thought about, let's say you've got a CBT therapist who is, their kind of whole, in a way, to an extent, and I guess there's a difference between theory and practice, because in practice, I'm sure a lot of CBT therapists would say, actually, we're a lot more nuanced, and, we do appreciate the wider forces that are bearing upon a person's life. But in theory, it's very much rooted in this individualistic, kind of rationalistic, I think you in this PTMF site, where this even comes from, like the Enlightenment with its, emphasis on rationality and stuff. And that actually we're needing to correct that, these sort of distortions. I mean, is it just maybe for someone to say there's somebody who's listening who's a CBT therapist, and they hear and they encounter the power threat meaning framework, and they think, oh wow, this is great. And I guess this could also apply to maybe a psychodynamic therapist as well, but I'm just using CBT. Is it perhaps then, just enough for that person to integrate it and trying to, again, just make their formulations and stuff a bit more nuanced? Because I suppose a CBT therapist can't fully undermine all of their training, can they?
Well, I come back to the point that this is fundamentally a kind of dense academic philosophical document, and what
Mm.
people do with it is 100% up to them, and what they
Okay,
take from
fine.
it is 100% up to them. One thing it isn't is a kind of campaign document, and one thing we decided very clearly when it was published was we literally didn't think beyond the launch. It was such an exhausting
Mm.
process getting there, and we did it in a way for our own intellectual satisfaction, and so we've achieved our aim, and our all of us who the core authors are people who spent a lifetime banging their heads against systems that don't want to change, which is very exhausting. And we thought, just for once, we'll write exactly what we damn well like.
Right.
Nobody ever reads that, and I very much take that position, and I think we all do. If people are
Mm.
interested, that's fine. I mean, we're,
Okay.
we're all very busy responding to invitations. The response has been massively beyond anything we could possibly have expected in terms of people's interest. It's now available in 7 different languages, or
Wow.
I mean, it's just extraordinary. We are entirely led by request, entirely led by demand. So, a
Mm.
CBT therapist, and I know many CBT therapists who work in a very sophisticated way and,
Mm.
have a lot of respect for their work. I personally think there is a fundamental clash between the core tenets of CBT that you have to adopt to some extent to be a
Mm.
CBT therapist and the power threat meaning framework. But as you say,
Mm.
it's also true of an awful lot of other approaches.
Right.
At a purely practical level, if the framework seems to add something to a CBT therapist's practice, then they want to incorporate those perspectives a bit to a greater extent. That I mean, that's great, and if they don't,
Mm.
that's entirely up to them.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, yeah, it's a sort of take it or leave it kind of approach, a sort of, this is
Yeah,
what
or take the bits of it that appeal to you. Yeah.
mm. And then do you have hopes or not? Does that same um, approach apply to not individuals or individual professionals, but actually in terms of, I don't know how you say, policymakers or I don't know if governments is the right, that we might too far away, but do you have a sense of like that maybe this will start to shape or is it already? In fact, I think I read, was it the All Parliamentary Group or some, there was like a
Yeah,
report or something. What was that
yeah.
around?
Okay, so there's an all-party parliamentary group. Is a group
Mm,
of MPs that by definition come from across the different parties
right.
who've voluntarily decided to set up a committee around a particular issue.
Mm,
There's about 200 of them, and they have all sorts of things that, like, almost any you can think of. There's a special interest group, an APPG. There is currently an APPG which calls itself Beyond Pills,
all
which has
right.
the agenda of promoting essentially more socially informed, non-diagnostic approaches to what we call mental health problems. So the APPGs have no formal powers. They can't insist on things or pass laws or anything, but they can obviously be influential pressure groups.
Mm,
So the APPG group, Beyond Pills, is made up of a number of people who include the kind of loose network I referred to earlier, like James Davis. So they are familiar with work, including the framework. So the framework is one of the approaches that they would seek to endorse as a way forward.
right.
So that's how the PTMF got mentioned in their kind of mission statement. So that's, a small way in which the framework is finding a place for itself within politics, within government.
Yeah.
And do we have hopes for it? I mean, yeah, the answer is in a way the same. If nothing more happens than has happened already, I will be very happy. I think I speak for the other authors too. If more things happen, we'll be even happier.
Mm,
And I suppose the bigger context of that is that I very much see the diagnostic paradigm as crumbling anyway. It's falling to pieces from within. It's kind of quite interesting watching it in a way. Stand well back, a lot of chaos, a lot of anger, a lot of friction, a lot of attacks, a lot of unpleasantness. But it's because
mm,
I think we are undergoing what we could call a paradigm shift, no matter what I do or the authors of the framework do, or if anyone ever reads the PTMF documents. I think it's happening anyway.
mm.
And if the framework can be a small part of moving towards, a better, more humane, more narrative, more meaning-based, more socially aware approach to people's very real ongoing struggles, then that's fab.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that. You see it as, yeah, sort of falling apart, perhaps, or I don't know, slowly or quickly, or um, and then in a way, then it was almost like maybe the power threat meaning framework it wasn't intended, but nor needed in order for that to happen. However, perhaps what it does do is it assuming that your observations are correct, and I can't comment on that, but like that it is falling apart slowly or quickly, that at least the power threat meaning framework is an alternative, which I think is the best one of the best words to use, to say, well, if somebody is going, oh, this isn't working anymore, we need something, at least there's this other option to, and it might not be the final I don't know, way of looking at things, but it's a move in a different direction.
Yeah, it's one of a number of options. Like we
Mm,
started off by saying there are already a lot of options out there. I mean, I think trauma-informed practice, as properly
mm.
understood, is a very powerful option, and that provides a lot of the evidence that the framework itself draws on. But certainly paradigms don't crumble. I mean, a number of things have to happen, but there has to be something to jump to, if you like. And the framework is hoping to be one of the many things that people might jump to.
And if you were to go back to yourself in 1989 and to see what's happened with, I suppose, would you be pleasantly surprised, do you think?
Yeah, I think I would. Yeah, I mean, the landscape is so different. There's hardly even there was a kind of lull, if you like, between what is sometimes called the anti-psychiatry movement of the 60s and 70s. But, that was
Mm,
around and that influenced me when I was at university and, first practicing. And some of the people
mm,
I worked with had worked with Lang, for example. So, But then there was a kind of big lull, if you like. It's like then we had the decade of the brain in the 1980s, and we were right back where we started, it seemed.
Right.
And I would have been astonished and delighted to see, how the field has opened up. We have entire publishing genres which are about kind of alternative approaches to mental health,
Mm,
not just three books by me, Mary, and Richard. And, we have a active and lively service user survival movement, which hardly existed then. I mean, my very first placement, the orthodoxy was you were not allowed to ask people who are said to be schizophrenic, which is nearly
mm.
everybody, you were not allowed to ask them about their delusions. I mean, now we have,
Really?
CBPP, it's best practice in nice guidelines. I have
Really?
some problems with that, but you were actually forbidden from doing that. That was very
Well, I was
important.
going to say, and for someone who read Young, that would be particularly frustrating because Young was very well known for,
Well,
seeing
well,
meaning in
exactly.
yeah, yeah.
Mad people, what he's interested in. No, I mean, it didn't fit with me at all. No. So we've come a long way.
And I suppose all of this, I mean, it's the phrase that comes to mind, which I see used more is epistemic justice. I think it's really, in a way, that's what mental health services, or no, no, we're not, the Pathway Mini framework is not just about mental health services, but for mental health services, it's a critical and perhaps should be some might say, oh, it's about making people better, but I don't know if you can tease the two apart. But epistemic justice, it's really important, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the idea that a particular form of injustice is the injustice that stops you from creating your own narratives and meanings about your own life.
Mm,
So, epistemic injustice, a good example of that from the PTMF point of view, is the imposition of a diagnostic narrative. Like you described someone you knew who went along and was told it's, like insulin for your diabetes. So that's
mm,
posing a story and silencing whatever stories people go along with. And people nearly always do go along with some idea of, this is something to do with whatever else has gone on in my life.
mm,
So we used to call this consciousness raising, of course. Same kind of thing, and so the framework is nothing will change unless our ways of thinking change. And as long as psychiatric services are dominated by essentially a process of epistemic injustice, silencing people's stories, and I include staff silencing their intuitions as well,
mm.
then nothing's going to change. But then if that changes, then in an amazing way, it has a knock-on domino effect and everything else changes. Which brings me back to the article we were discussing about using the PTMF on inpatient wards in London. And that came out very clearly from the staff and service user accounts. As soon as I understood it in this way, then I started thinking, well, maybe we should try this instead. And it made sense to do this, and it made sense to do less of this, and so on.
So yeah, yeah, yeah. I'll link that paper as well because it's good to read actually. It's very helpful. Um, so they won't. Can people expect they shouldn't expect a power threat meaning framework 2.0?
No. So we have a website which the BPS has generally hosted. So in
Mm,
a sense, the 2.0 is the website because
mm,
one of the things we hoped was that if it took off in any way at all, well, it becomes a sort of co-constructed project from then on, from
okay.
publication date on, January the 19th, 2018. It's kind of over to you folks if you're interested. And if you are interested, try it out, let us know, do some
Mm,
evaluations. We'll put them on the website. That will feed back further into the project. So part 2.0 is the whole website in a way, and a lot of other stuff that's going on, which I know is happening, but haven't managed to persuade people to submit to the website yet. But we are, for example, developing a whole new set of patterns. There's about 6 new ones up on the website, but that's the second
oh,
edition.
really? Six
Yeah.
additional?
Yeah, yeah. There's one
Oh,
on middle-aged men and suicidality. There's one on stalking behavior. There's one on uh, surviving living in poverty. There's a few of them.
okay. Well, I think that covers most of what I was hoping to talk about.
Good. Well, that's plenty for people who've listened this far. It's plenty for them to get their teeth into.
Yeah, and for those who have and would like to learn more, yeah, I will link. So I'll link for those who are brave or feel adventurous. They could read the original document.
They
How
have a little spare time. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But there's also, as you said, there's the straight talking introduction. Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Straight to the introduction to the path threat meaning framework. Yeah.
yeah. Which I can link for that. Yeah.
Good. Well, good luck on your course, and it's been
Thanks.
a pleasure to chat.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. It's been a pleasure to chat for me, and yeah, I've personally really enjoyed reading what I have of the Power Threat Meaning Framework, and it's definitely. I don't know how it's. I mean, yeah, it's. I mean, to be honest, working as an AP at points, it did. I did sort of draw on it, and other professionals did, and I've seen. I think the central point of it for me is it's just changing it's that maybe it's simplistic, but it's what's happened to you.
Mm.
It's what's happened to you, what's happening to you, and how are you making
Yeah.
sense out of it. And it can go so far, can't it?
Yeah.
Mm.
It's a simple yet powerful shift of perspective, isn't it? Yeah.
Mm. Okay, well, yeah, all the best.
Great. Pleasure to talk.
All right.
Bye then.